Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome on behalf of Vaccines Europe and EFPIA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, to this discussion on United in the Search for a COVID-19 Vaccine. My name is Jackie Davis. I have the privilege of moderating this totally interactive debate as we hear about the latest developments and discuss the key questions relating to the search for and eventual delivery of vaccines against COVID-19. As I say, it'll be an entirely interactive conversation based on questions first from me to our speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then from all of you. If you want to ask a question, there are two ways you can do it. You can either click on the question and answer button. Please use the Q&A button for this and write your question. Could I ask you, please, if you do choose that method, to be brief? Twitter length or less would be great, so I can see at a glance what you want to ask and who you want to ask it to. You can also, if you want to speak, click on the raised hands button, and then I will unmute you when we come to that point and give you the floor. Again, brief if you could. We have a lot of people, 250 people on this call today, so we may not be able to get to all of you, but I will do my very best. If you're having IT issues and you need some behind the scenes help, you can use the chat button to speak to our wizards who are monitoring everything to make sure it all goes smoothly. So let me now introduce our speakers. I'm delighted to welcome Jean Lang, who is Associate Vice President, Research and Development at Sanofi Pasteur, and he's Chair of the Research Working Group at Vaccines Europe. Martin Seychelles, Deputy Director General in the Directorate General for Health and Food Safety, better known to us in Brussels as Santé, in the European Commission. And Pierre Van Dam, Full Professor and Vice Dean at the University of Antwerp, Faculty of Medicine and Health Science. So we're going to start with a sort of overview of where we are now to set the context for our discussion, and then we'll talk about some of the challenges to build on that progress and what we do if and when that research leads to a vaccine that we know works. So let's start with that context setting and the eyes of the world, of course, on this question above all else, the search for a vaccine, and we're seeing unprecedented cooperation to try and deliver it at speed. Jean, can you give me a sense, please, of where we are in terms of the number of different vaccine that are in development, the number of trials? Where are we? What is the industry doing?
I think industry and the European industry at Vaccine Europe, which I'm representative from the vaccine developers, are incredibly active, motivated and committed to that. As I speak, there are almost 110 initiatives for vaccine development commitment. And the vaccine industry, but not only, because also diagnosis and the therapeutic therapeutic industry is also committed to that. But at the same time, we need also to not disrupt an whole health value chain, because, for example, for vaccines, we know there are critical vaccines that could add comorbidities. So we do not to disrupt the supply of these vaccines for Europe. What the key words I want to highlight here is really partnerships and collaborations. Traditionally, the vaccine and the pharma industry is a highly competitive one, as we all know. And here, what is really important that we all join forces together to search for a cure or a preventive medicine. So we are working along the line of a regulatory and health agenda that was set up by the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization decided on the research priority as early as February 11th. So we are working along the same line. We are sharing our progresses together among the world. There are some vaccines that are much more advanced. I think there are 8 to 10 vaccines already in phase 1 as we speak, and we are hoping to progress. And of course, the key paradigm is it's called for us and the world pandemic paradigm. We are trying to stretch every phase as possible, but at the same time, we are highly cognizant that we are injecting vaccine to healthy people. So safety, security of the vaccine is an absolutely a must, and we need to take that. So all in all, we are envisioned that the vaccine could be available maybe in 1 year, 1.5 years, but not before, because there is some safety steps that we need absolutely to fulfill so that we guarantee that the vaccine will put on the market,
So predictions of early 2021, you think are overambitious. It's more likely to be summer.
Yeah, we talked about the second semester of 2021. Again, keep in mind that vaccine development is highly complex. It's long, it's challenging. We used to say that we have 3 critical milestones to overcome. The one that some developers are already working on is moving from preclinical, having satisfactory preclinical data, to phase 1, so limited human volunteers, to guarantee the safety, to be sure that we receive the appropriate protective response in human. Then we'll stretch, because we currently are grouping phase 1, 2. So we are actually enrolling hundreds of volunteers. And then we'll move to the next phase, hopefully by next year, in phase 3 efficacy.
We'll talk a little bit more about where we go from here later on. But Professor Van Dam, Jean there underlining, this is all about joining forces, working together, partnership and collaboration. You're involved in a public-private partnership with ULB and with the support of the Belgian federal government. Can you tell me a little bit about how the advantages of working in that way in a public-private partnership and what you hope to achieve? You are doing something very specific. Perhaps briefly you could outline what that is.
Sure. And thank you, all of you, for the invitation, and thank you, Jean, for the introduction. And indeed, as Jean said, it's very important to join forces, I would say, not only in pandemic periods, but also outside pandemic periods. But in particular, today it's very important. And what we have been doing in Belgium is a number. We are very experienced in the conduct of phase 1 and phase 2 studies. As Jean said, this is a needed step to develop a vaccine, to test it first in a small number of participants. Phase 2 is a larger number of participants, and you further document safety, and you further document the ability to trigger immunity and antibodies. And then usually you go in the phase 3 situation, where you will start to vaccinate a larger group of people, usually 1,000 people, and 1,000 people receive another vaccine, a placebo vaccine, and then you just see what happens, I would say, in real life. And of course, that's very tricky these days, because we do everything to reduce the incidence of the disease. So it's very hard to show in a phase 3 trial that you can trigger protective efficacy, or you have to have a very large number of volunteers and a very long period of testing this vaccine. And of course, doesn't fit in the acceleration of testing vaccines. So what happens now is that in Belgium, we received the support to set up a quarantine unit at the University of Antwerp, and to collaborate with the Université Libre de Bruxelles on the immunological part of the research. And not new, there are these kind of quarantine units already exist in some places of the world. It would be interesting to have that also in Europe, where in an academic center you are able to vaccinate a number of people. Let's say 15 subjects will be vaccinated with a candidate vaccine, and 15 subjects receive a placebo vaccine, and then after a while they will be challenged. That's what we call the CHIM studies, so the controlled human infection model studies. They will be exposed to a strain, COVID-19 strain or an attenuated strain. And then after a while, once they are in quarantine, you can follow them every day. Of course, you have to do everything that the virus vaccine, or the virus does not escape from that facility. That's why they are in quarantine. And you follow them day after day during usually 10, 15 days, depending on the incubation time. And you can count the number of people that get ill in the group of vaccinees versus the group of those who receive the placebo. And that's a very quick way to show whether your vaccine is protective, yes or no.
Because one of the concerns that I've heard expressed by some people who are doing these vaccine trials is, of course, as the prevalence of the virus in the community goes down, that potentially extends the time it takes to see if it works. You're finding a way to get around that. And the collaboration, working with government money, and with another university, how important is that to be able to do what you're doing?
Well, having this kind of facility is in fact an extra cornerstone in the whole vaccine development. So you have the phase 1, the phase 2, the phase 3 in ideal situation, and then you have this kind of facility which accelerates the development of vaccine. It is not linked to companies, it is independent. And so we can start to work with companies on a contract base to say, look, you are welcome with your candidate vaccine, and we start to test that within the facility. That's in fact the idea.
Yeah.
At the same time, because we work with the Université Libre de Bruxelles on the more immunological part, it's also very interesting in these kind of studies to look at the protective efficacy of vaccines and the correlate of protection, because that will be one of the challenges. What do we need to be protected? Do we need purely antibodies? Do we need cellular immunity? Do we need IgG? Do we need IgA? So that is all very feasible to have our volunteers to test that.
Okay.
Of course, these kind of challenge studies can only be done under very strict ethical considerations. And so we can only do these kind of challenge studies if we have a therapy for COVID-19. Because if you start to challenge people, and you know in advance that some of them will suffer from the disease, you need to be able to quickly also.
Okay.
So that's linked all together to therapy and to prevention.
Thank you very much. Lots of challenges. I'd like to discuss where we go from here in a moment. But Martin Seychelles, in terms of the role of the Commission in this joint effort, what would you highlight most particularly about what you're doing to support the development of the vaccine? And we'll come on later to the question of its deployment, manufacture and distribution, but particularly in terms of the development of it. What for you would you highlight? And I'm thinking here particularly what's being done with all that massive amount of money that was raised at the pledging conference in May, 7.4 billion. And Ursula von der Leyen called that today's sprint, which was a great start for our marathon. What's happening internally in running that marathon?
Yes, thank you. Well, the previous speakers have outlined very well the challenges. So our job, working together, of course, with the member states and with other international partners, is to really provide the right framework for that kind of work to not only to happen, but also because we are in this specific situation, we need to have in place a strategy that will maximize the chances of success. I mean, the development of any vaccine is always scientifically a very big challenge. We need to maximize those chances, and also to do that in the shortest possible time frame, because the toll this disease is having from an economic, social point of view is tremendous. So our role is to provide a framework. So how do we do that? Very, very important. There are a number of dimensions to this. First of all, there is a very strong, inescapable political dimension to this. The previous speakers emphasized already the importance of collaboration, of cooperation. This cannot be allowed to degenerate into a race who gets there first, because individually we are all, not in the strongest position. So the only way to improve our chances of success is to work together. And this requires a lot of political efforts. We are working at the moment on outlining our approach in a communication that will be hopefully presented very, very soon. This is something, of course, where we are using and trying to leverage the combined strength of the European Union. So when it comes to, for example, negotiating and discussing with the industry, it's a much less confusing picture if Europe can speak with one voice. There's also a very strong global dimension. So that's one element, the political dimension, which should not be underestimated. Then there's a very strong financial component to this, of course. The development of any vaccine costs an enormous amount of money, and particularly if you want to do it in the shortest possible time. So the pledging event, as you mentioned, was a great success. So that was, as the president put it, the start of a long process. We are using and trying to deploy every possible instrument we have. The research program has been mobilized, the emergency support instrument, the EIB with its InnoFin instrument. And of course, we are looking also at how we can use the new MFF as from next year also, because now the point you made about research and then what comes next, I mean, we see this as one continuous process, because whoever is working on developing a vaccine needs also to have as much certainty as we can possibly provide. So we cannot separate the research part from what happens next. So, for example, I mean, you will need to, especially if you want to shorten the timeframes, you will need to start discussions on, for example, advanced purchasing before the vaccine is actually available.
Absolutely.
Because if we wait until we have the vaccine and then we start discussing and then we start negotiating, all this adds time, and we don't have time. We're running out of time because we need to end this as soon as possible. So, and then of course there is the final thing, which John understood, is the practical arrangements. Producing a vaccine is also a specific industrial process. We need to make sure there are no bottlenecks, no hurdles. What is our manufacturing capacity? What will be the strategy on how we will prioritize who gets vaccinated first? I mean, industry needs to know this to plan their production. And while it may seem to be early to talk about these things, it's not early, because all this has a big bearing on decisions which need to be taken.
Lots to come back to there. And of course, industry also ramping up its manufacturing capabilities. We're hearing companies talking about producing vaccines even before they're sure that they will work and they'll get regulatory approval, because they can't afford to wait. So we're seeing this. I mean, I was very struck listening to you, Jean, and you're talking about the time frame. You know, we know that normally you need several years of R&D as a minimum. You then need 12 to 36 months to get the manufacturing capacity ready for distribution. These amazingly accelerated timeframes. Just in terms of the research first, Jean and Pierre, perhaps, where do we need to go from here? So we already, as you said, 110 in production, 8 to 10 in phase 1. What's the big challenge now? What's the next step? And then we'll come to those other issues that Martin has raised. Jean.
Yeah, you know, as you mentioned, Jackie, and the previous speakers too, we are moving at unprecedented speed. So it's called the pandemic paradigm. It's not to wait. You know, classically we define our preclinical phase from 2 to 4 years, and we move to 1 to 2 years for phase 1, 2 to 3 years to phase 2, phase 3, licensure, and then we decide based on all the positive milestones that have been achieved to invest into a manufacturing facility to scale up and to discuss with the regulators and the global health public regarding the needs for supply and vaccination, etc. Here we are stretching everything. So we are taking risk. That's our job. We are entrepreneurial. We need to manage risk, but we have also to be conscious about the risk. So we have risk management plan we discussed. And for example, for the manufacturing, it meant that we need to buy the raw material in our factories, in our plants right now. And that is in the negotiation with the regulators and the global health and the regulators and the partnerships, because honestly, at the end, what will be the people to vaccinate? How many will they be? So that we can ramp up our facility and adjust by a very equilibrium dialogue and reaching a balance between our investments and what will be needed at the end. So it's really taking risk but in a conscious manner, and of course, never ever sacrificing the safety, the security, and the consistency of manufacturing, because at the end we vaccinate healthy people.
Absolutely. And Pierre, that is the key, isn't it? Because there is this desperation to get this vaccine. The risk that corners might be, or there will be a pressure to cut corners. Politicians, governments saying, come on, we need this thing. Where is it? Do you see that as, what for you is the key challenge to get from where we are now to where we're going to need to be ready to do this as quickly as possible?
Well, I think we will very well have to prepare the public, the general public, that the vaccine is not there tomorrow. Some people start to talk to the public, to the general public, and people might expect to have a vaccine already by the end of the year, and then they will be very disappointed if that is not the situation, and that can backfire, I would say, to public health and to the vaccines in general and to the immunization program. So we have to be realistic. And as Jean said, and as we heard already, everyone wants to save time and to go faster than usual without sacrificing safety. And I think that is also very important that we add that to our communication. It's not because the ethics committee starts to approve a dossier or a vaccine trial faster than usual that they don't look at safety issues, but it's a fast track. So that means all the other applications are put aside, and the COVID-19 is a fast track, the same at the level of the regulators. And that means we can save a month or two through that approval process. A lot of companies started from existing platforms. So something that know very well in terms of production, in terms of safety, in terms of how to make the vaccine. And also that people need to understand. So a number of companies will not start from scratch. It is a way that they are used to develop vaccines, whether it is a protein-based vaccines or an adeno-based vaccines. They know what they are talking about. Also, the regulators know what is in the vaccine. And that is also very important. There is a confident relationship between the producers, the researchers, and I would say also the regulators. And finally, I think it's good to have all these different vaccines in competition with each other, because that forces each company, I would say, to save time and not just to sit down and to think, but we have to move forward. We will need a large number of different vaccines to cover the world. So it's good 6 to 10 products maybe by the second half of 2021, so that these vaccines are available for a larger public than just having maybe 1 or 2 vaccines where everyone is fighting for. So we need really to have these vaccines available. And then I think that that's what you were saying. A number of companies started or decided to start production and upscaling even before having the data. And this has nothing to do with safety. It's a kind of financial risk company takes, and that's their, I think that's their duty. They can do that. And it can save easily 6 months to a year, because they can start producing. And if it's at the end of the row, or at the end of the whole development, it appears that the vaccine is very safe and also very protective, okay, that's fantastic. Then you can immediately use that vaccine that was already in production. So these are all ways to, I would say, have a fast product that is well documented and safe.
Thank you. And Martin, I mean, in terms of everything being done at the same time, so you talked about you need to start talking about advanced purchasing ahead of time. We're seeing this ramping up of production capacity now, but also this intention to move to actually producing and so on. And of course, the other aspect of this is the regulatory approval. How important is it that the dialogue between you and the researchers as things are being developed, as these different potential vaccines are being developed, so that we're ready there as well to make sure that the regulatory approval can be accelerated without in any way compromising it, as Pierre was just emphasizing it, and everyone stresses safety first. But have you changed the way you're talking to industry as this research is carried out to make sure that the things go in tandem rather than in sequence?
Yes, I think that's absolutely key. And I think it's very important to explain really well. When we talk about accelerating timeframes, this is not about cutting corners or about changing the rules. The rules remain the same. The rules are what they are. And ultimately, every vaccine that will be authorized will have to meet the standards of quality, safety, and efficacy. What we're talking about here is working, as you said, in parallel, not in series. In normal times, we can take things step by step. So there are various steps along the way, and once a product is then developed, we sit down, we negotiate, and sometimes it's done by countries individually, of course, and so that takes time. So to accelerate, what we need to do is work as much as possible in parallel, knowing that, of course, that will incur a certain financial risk. It's inevitable, but let's keep in mind we are taking a big hit every day from this pathogen. And the longer this goes on, the impact on our populations, globally speaking, on our societies, on our economies, is mounting. So it's a risk that which we can take if it's a calculated risk. So and the whole strategy is in fact based around doing things in parallel that would normally be done sequentially. Now, of course, this means that we need to have a very strong coordination, dialogue between those who are engaged in different parts of the process. For example, the issue of what was mentioned, who will be vaccinated first? So as the production eventually comes on stream, it will happen in a gradual way. It will not be instantly available in unlimited amounts, certainly not. So, of course, in normal times, you would look at the characteristics of the vaccine, and then you decide on the basis of the characteristics. But here we have another element. We have a pandemic, which has already killed large numbers of people. And we know, for example, which groups of the population are most at risk from the disease, because we know the epidemiology. So we can already start to form an initial idea of which population groups might be more at risk, could benefit more from a vaccine, or are more frequently exposed to the pathogen, and therefore should be maybe prioritized for access to the first doses of the vaccine when they become. So this is something which becomes even more important for this situation than would normally be the case.
And as you say, that conversation starts now. There's a couple of specifically research questions come in. I'm going to take those and then we'll come back to some of these issues, more broad issues about exactly what you were talking about. We haven't talked yet about pricing, we haven't talked about vaccine confidence and so on, but let me take these more research-based questions. Wearables and remote monitoring tools can allow for 24/7 monitoring of parameters relating to COVID. This has the potential to speed up trials, but the data needs to be accepted by agencies such as the EMA and FDA. Questions: are there plans to use these wearables in the vaccine trials? And are there discussions with the agencies on them accepting the data that comes from them? So do you see wearables and remote monitoring tools as having a role to play here? Who can come in on that? Pierre or Jean? Pierre, can you help us with that at all?
Well, so far in the protocols that are circulating for the phase 1 and phase 2 studies, we have not seen those wearables yet. I think it's potentially possible for the future to collect indeed data, but it's not yet in use as far as I've seen in the recent protocols.
Okay.
But
yeah, I guess, yeah, Pierre, I fully concur. We are all obsessed with digital health. So, and there are many ways artificial intelligence and machine learning could help us in the future. We are certainly monitoring how these tools could help us, but we are to rely because we have no time to experiment and to investigate these new, very nice processes. And we rush to do what we do, and we can expedite, for example, by multiplying clinical trial sites around ethical guidelines, epidemiology, etc., under the guideline of regulatory authority and the World Health Organization too.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question here from Jacqueline Bowman from the European Association for the Study of Obesity saying, with evidence coming through on the extra viral load for people with obesity, as well as the need to take biological immunocompromised systems due to the disease progression of obesity into account, how can this be factored into and integrated into the development of a vaccine? Again, our scientists, can you help? Pierre?
Well, of course, these more vulnerable populations, but these are the people with a higher body mass index or people with a certain background, medical background, or more aged people, will be part of phase 2 trials, for instance, and also in an adaptive design of a phase 2 trial, you can start with healthy volunteers and then start to document more and more also the participation of other populations in your phase 2 trial, in particular to show that the response in those vulnerable groups is comparable to the response that you see in the traditional healthy adult volunteers. So I think that's in particular important if we want to prioritize some groups to get the vaccine once the vaccine is available. So I'm sure that this will be taken very seriously in the early development of vaccines by the companies and the protocols and the regulators.
Thank you. Martin, one you might be able to help us with. Are member states being encouraged to share methodologies available around COVID-19, including exploring antibody testing? Are you helping to coordinate that work?
Well, yes, first of all, on the approval of the vaccine itself, of course, there's a strong role for the European Medicines Agency, and given the nature of this vaccine, it would be authorized by the EMA through the centralized process. So obviously that coordination there is guaranteed for the authorization part. But obviously it's also important when it comes to, for example, organizing the clinical trials to work in collaboration. So to ensure that there is a sufficient body of data that would allow meaningful conclusions and regulatory outcomes. And this is an issue, of course, which has emerged quite strongly during the COVID pandemic. We had already some experiences with therapeutics, for example, where initially you had some very small clinical trials which were very difficult to draw conclusions from. We cannot afford that for a vaccine. It has to be done in a way where the results are unequivocal and leave no doubt for where it comes to interpretation. But I think, on the regulatory side, that is pretty much assured because of the central role of the European Medicines Agency in this respect. So the clinical trial would obviously be approved, and then it would be the basis for an eventual authorization by them.
Yeah, and beside that, Martin and Pierre, they are, as you know, they are very efficient mechanism for public-private partnerships in terms of R&D and innovations. And such efforts are looking exactly at harmonizing methods, correlate of surrogate of protection, some biomarkers, and there are many ongoing research efforts at European level and even beyond. For example, CEPI, the Coalition for Preparedness Innovations, is setting up a very specific analytical tool, and of course with the help of the European Commission and so forth. So as vaccine developers, we are well cognizant, aware, and participating actively to these groups.
Thank you. There's a very specific question, Pierre, which maybe I could put to you. Can you clarify which funding has been directed towards the clinical trial at the University of Antwerp? What is the name of the program instrument used? And is there cooperation with the Belgian Federal Healthcare Centre of Expertise in Research? So very specific, brief answer if you would.
Well, in fact, the funding is from the Belgian government directly to the University of Antwerp and Université Libre de Bruxelles. It's 50% of the funding. So we are looking for co-funding from international organizations, perhaps from the EU, from the Wellcome Trust and CEPI, to have the full package funded. And in fact, it's a funding that was already approved by the government in 2018 as a kind of investment pact in research in Belgium. Unfortunately, the government didn't stay long at that moment. We had to wait for a new government. And of course, COVID-19 was a kind of momentum to convince the politicians in Belgium to invest in this kind of facility so that we have a quarantine challenge facility on the continent to assist, I would say, all those who develop vaccines. In particular, of course, the pharma industry, the biotech industry, but also the research institutions who try to develop a vaccine.
Okay. And one other one, which really is directed at you, very short. Could we have a situation where older and at-risk people cannot be included in challenge studies, but are the first to be in line for the vaccine?
Well, the challenge study, of course, will target really healthy adults, and we will look at the biology of a disease. So if you look at COVID-19, probably we will go for the 20 to 29-old adults, because we know that the disease will not be very much pronounced and with a lot of complications in that age group. In addition, of course, we want to be able to treat them, and we will not put a very vulnerable person in a challenge study. That is obvious. But this is nothing about whether a vulnerable person can be part of a phase 3 trial or of an advanced phase 2 trial. That's something completely different. What we try to show in a phase 3 is that your vaccine is protective. That is important. And at which level of antibodies, for instance, the vaccine might be protective.
This is, Jackie, this is what we call translational model. And we are trying to approach that, what Pierre said, in animal model, in HP, in ferrets, in hamsters. But at the end of the day, we know that humans is a good model for humans, and maybe the translational value will be there. Mm-hmm. And again, I applaud for the efforts that are fueled in Europe by Pierre and his group.
Thank you. We have lots of questions coming in about the prioritization issues. And of course, at that major pledging conference, leaders said any potential vaccine should be, and I quote, available, accessible, and affordable to all. We've seen Germany, France, Netherlands, Italy have come together in what they call the Inclusive Vaccines Alliance. Mm-hmm. They've invited other member states to join in to make sure that any vaccine that is developed is available and affordable for Europeans. There is the question also of lower middle income countries. Lots of questions here about how you prioritize. A thought, Martin, from you, if you would. You talked about already asking that question of who gets it first. Does this mean we need an EU-wide pandemic vaccine strategy specifically to answer these questions before we get to them?
I think we need to have a discussion and clarity on the criteria that we will use to prioritize. Ultimately, of course, governments will purchase the vaccines for their citizens, and they will allocate those vaccine doses. But that needs to be done on the basis of scientific evidence. And scientific evidence, there are two types. One is information about the vaccine itself. So different vaccines might obviously be indicated for different categories. And that's, of course, It's true for any medicine, and the vaccine is a medicine in that respect. But also what we know about the disease itself. So we know that there are certain population groups that are more at risk from serious complications of the disease, whether it's age, whether it's comorbidities, whether it's other aspects as well. But of course, the point you made and the point that was stressed by the Commission all along is very important. Access and equitable access are going to be a big part of this, because for any communicable disease, especially one that is raging across the whole planet, you will not be able to have an end game and put this behind us unless we manage to defeat the disease in every corner of the world. That's the reality, and that means we will need to work to make sure that vaccines that will be produced are not only available, but are accessible, and are accessible in a fair and equitable way. And this is important when it comes to things like planning the production capacity. We are very much looking at seeing if we should have also capacity, not just to produce vaccines for our own needs, but also to contribute to the global need. And we hope others will do the same. But it's really important to start the discussions now. Understanding, for example, now that we've had a few months of this disease behind us, and maybe we are in let's say a period which allows this, to study very well what have been the results, for example, of the treatments in hospitals, etc. How can we refine our knowledge about the epidemiology? Even issues like the role of comorbidities. I mean, understanding the mortality rates, etc. This needs to be very well understood, because these will be the basis for any decision on prioritization. And then, of course, we will match that with the available supply, and we hope that obviously will be as significant as possible, as large as possible.
Okay, thank you. A thought on this question of prioritization, Pierre, Jean. Jean first.
Yeah, in terms of vaccinations, the questions are who to vaccinate, which groups to vaccinate, and then when you have who to vaccinate, so how much do we need to vaccinate? And there is magic not. We say that we had to vaccinate 60 to 70% of the population to get rid of the circulation of the virus to build that herd immunity. And then that translate to how many we have to vaccinate and where to vaccinate. And as global industry and developers, so far we are all the commitment to make the vaccines we are developing right now, and we hopefully, as Pierre said, there will be several vaccines from different companies. Again, the world is working together because we need a vaccine solution, and given the estimated hundreds of millions to vaccinate, there is ample room for many vaccines there, hopefully. Not only to mitigate the risk, because there will be some attrition rate among all the technology we are developing. So, and then that discussions needs to be built with public health officials, because at the end, we want to create value for the vaccine we will deploy, and that value will be co-owned by the public health officials and the regulators. We have target product profile, for example, under the auspices of the World Health Organization, but we need also to have target value profile so that we ensure that the vaccine we'll deploy will be affordable, accessible, and where the world needs it in the population that most need it. And that's the commitment we are making at Vaccine Europe and industry and developers.
Thank you. And Pierre, comment from you. There are questions here relating to should obesity be named as one of the high-risk groups and therefore among the first to be vaccinated? Will it be necessary to vaccinate vulnerable groups? Could it be possible to say, okay, herd immunity for the 20 to 65s, and we only need to concentrate on the older people? How do you see, as a scientist, this whole question of prioritization?
I think, as Martin said, we learn a lot, of course, en cours de route, and increasingly we start to see who are the vulnerables based on the epidemiology, on the data collection, and that will be indeed the first wave of those who will need to be vaccinated. So we will have the age, and we'll have the typical comorbidity and vulnerable people. We will have to go in 2 stages, because we won't have immediately, I would say, vaccines for everyone, or for 60 to 70% of the population to guarantee herd immunity. And herd immunity is something that you cannot define according to a certain age group or age range. It will be really the population at large. And I think by the time we try to target a larger population, we have to think about how are we going to roll out the immunization programs. I think in Europe, we do have a lot of structures to vaccinate people. In low and middle countries, that would be a bigger challenge. But anyway, I think we will have to think about also already now, how are we going to rolling out these vaccine programs? Are we going to use the traditional ways, like a GP for a certain age group? Maybe we have to include the pharmacists to start to vaccinate actively all over Europe. Why not? A number of countries are doing this for flu immunization. So we have to think already now, how are we going to organize ourselves to have a very broad coverage with this vaccine? Do we have to think about another system of syringe and needle and maybe have a kind of inhalation vaccine, intradermal vaccine, a patch vaccine? So these are things that can start in parallel, I would say, with all the documentation of phase 1 and phase 2.
Lots of questions coming in about manufacturing and the industry role. We'll come back to those in a moment, but I'm going to try and give the floor, if the technology works, to Nitty Paul. Nitty, I cannot see, your hand is up, but your microphone is not available to me at the moment. So I don't know whether we can make that work, or I will take Nitty. You wrote a number of questions into the field. I'm going to try, there we try again. Let's try and see if I can activate you. Now, for some reason, it is not giving me the option of giving you the floor. I will, therefore, let me share with you what you wrote about, Nitty, because you talked about who will you consult in deciding on prioritization. And I think there was a second one. And how can, that's a separate, that's to do with the company side. So we'll come back to that. But who do you consult? Who do you talk to? Because I'm thinking here, listening to you all talk, obviously there are many science questions to be answered in this prioritization, but also the public, Martin. If people are to accept whatever is decided about prioritization, they need to be involved in those ethical discussions, don't they?
Of course. Well, first of all, the science has to be done in the best possible way and in a transparent way. So here we have the role, for example, of the ECDC, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, which is already working on understanding as much as possible the epidemiology, and we now have an extensive body of evidence from the past, the experience of the past few months. That needs to be digested, analyzed, and presented in a way, not just for regulators or for governments, but also in a way that can be also communicated to the public. Also, I mean, of course, the work which is being done in the European Medicines Agency. This is important because having a solution, as you rightly said, is not the whole picture. We also need to make sure that society understands how best to use this tool once these tools are available. And we've learned from past experience with other products not to underestimate this. And I think, you know, we all realize we can only put this thing behind us when there is a vaccine or some other effective treatment which can be administered and which would relieve and take away the pressure on hospitals, which is what we've been through in the past few months. So the public needs to really be informed at every step of the way. There needs to be a full consultation. All this has to be done in a very transparent way, but based on sound science. We have to avoid, I know there's a lot of pressure to kind of communicate things sometimes very early on, but we have to explain step by step, and that the science is sound, and the science also is being looked at in the appropriate way. I think when it comes to then the ethical issues, like, for example, deciding on issues about risk, populations, etc., again, this has to be based on the science. These are not decisions which should be taken on the basis just of a discussion. The discussion needs to be based on evidence. And that's what we're doing now. And we've already tasked the agencies to collect this information and to start elaborating it so that we can then discuss it and present it to the member states and to the general public.
And just a word, if you would, Jean, so to this question of the public and vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about the immense pressure to come up with a vaccine,
Yeah.
but that will also lead to concerns if it's done very quickly. There will be people who are skeptical about vaccines generally, and particularly when it's done at speed. How do you see the role of industry in addressing that issue and making sure that we get the take up once we have the, we've decided who the priority groups are, we have the doses available, then we have to get them to actually take them up. Do you see this as a major challenge?
I think what guided us is the so-called benefit-risk ratio. So we need to put develop vaccine that are positive benefits for the intended populations. For example, as we experienced for SARS-CoV-1 in 2003, 2004, we developed vaccines also very quickly, but at the end, the epidemics disappeared, so there was no benefit, or no need for vaccines. And again, targeting, and this is a dialogue. This is not something we, industry or vaccine developers, own. We have a dialogue with regulatory authority, and we have a dialogue with health public officials at large, who to vaccinate against based on the benefit. And of course, at-risk population may be the first wave, given we have not all the vaccine will need later on. And that I see this an exemplification of cooperations, partnerships, and dialogue. And the good things, and there is silver lining of this crisis, that we have this increasing dialogue with the regulators, with public health officials, putting on the table questions regarding investment in manufacturing, and we tackle that questions together. But at the end, the commitment is to have a benefit-risk ratio, and industry will play its role. We are a partner in health. We are not making the call who to vaccinate, where to vaccinate, but at least we provide data of quality and sufficient amount so that at the end, the regulators and the public health officials, the Ministry of Health, make the right decision to who to vaccinate and when to vaccinate, and given the number of doses available.
Thank you. And Pierre, someone from our audience also raising the question of vaccine hesitancy and saying, is this something we need to address at EU level as well as nationally?
Well, I think so. And I think we have to do that even independently from COVID-19. It is something that is linked to vaccine and immunization programs. Adding COVID-19 will not change the attitude of hesitant people. We already start to see that today. In the communication, people who start to think, well, do we need a vaccine? What will be the safety profile of the vaccine? All kind of complot theory already circulating against immunization programs. So we see the same kind of mechanisms that exist for other immunization programs. So we have to learn from that and to well communicate in time about where we are with the vaccine. This is a task that companies can do in a very transparent way.
Yes.
And then give really information, I would say, just step by step where we are, and it's up to the EU and it's up to ECDC to prepare a guidance document on the risk groups and on the groups that preferably will be vaccinated. And then tax in the different countries will take over and make recommendations locally. So I think that there needs to be a good consensus all over Europe how to address this.
And somebody making the point, Niti Pal in our audience making the point, actually patients and citizens can also help to translate the science for the public better. So another crucial reason why they need to be involved. I'm getting a lot of questions relating to, and it links to vaccine hesitancy, but Martin, will there be a mandatory uptake of vaccines necessary for traveling, for lifting restrictions, immunity passports? Should the EU require that all internal travelers have a COVID vaccine? And if you do, then do you need to have a uniform regulation of this in the different member states? How do you see this whole question?
Ultimately, decisions of this nature will be taken by national governments. But from our side, what we want to ensure is, first of all, that we do have vaccines available, and I speak in the plural, because we will need more than one, certainly. We also need to make sure that that happens in the shortest possible time, is accompanied by all the information that governments will need to take these kind of decisions. I think it's an issue of really informing the public once the vaccine is available about the benefits of that vaccine. I mean, I think we all now know all too well what this disease can do. And if we do not stop it, it will continue to wreak havoc. And we're already seeing what it's doing in other parts of the world, even worse the situation than was the case in Europe. So this will not go away on its own. Of course, there are a number of tools that we need to use. So a lot of this is also linked to our own behavior and progress on other areas like therapeutics and so on. But ultimately, we know that the only way to definitively exit from this, as we have done for other infectious diseases, I mean, the only diseases we have managed to eradicate or control very effectively have been through a vaccine. We know whether it's smallpox or polio or other, major killers. We have only been able to relegate these to the history books in total, or at least in major part, thanks to a vaccine. And this will be no different. It's a virus. So this has to be very well understood. Otherwise, we will have to face periodic resurgences of this. And this is why also the global effort is so important. We cannot just focus on Europe. We cannot just focus on some parts of the world. We have to focus globally, because that's where the virus will reemerge from if we're not careful.
Jean.
Yeah, I just wanted to add what was said by Pierre and Martin. The one of the striking benefits of vaccine as compared to drugs, that we have a dual effect. We have a patient individual effect and we have a population effect. So if a country decides to have a large vaccination program in terms of coverage, you know that in this country that the circulation transmission will cease. And of course, if another country decides to vaccinate a subgroup, specialized group, then the virus might still be transmitted and circulate. So the national and the European-based vaccination policy will be extremely important for how to assess the risk and what will be the barrier, etc., as was discussed. So that's one of the benefits of the vaccine, that it's a patient and a population benefit.
There's quite a lot of questions relating to the companies who will be involved in the manufacture. So whether, obviously, if a company develops a vaccine and it gets regulatory approval, they will manufacture their own vaccine, but is also talking about sharing of capabilities, one of the unprecedented collaborations, so that you can use as much capability as there is out there. How do you see that process, all of you, in terms of choosing which companies will be involved in manufacture? Will it be geographical? Will it be according to their importance? And how do you see the role of procurement in all of this? Because, of course, Martin, we have the joint procurement agreement, which is already being used for medical equipment, for masks and so on, but eventually could be used for the vaccines. So when we get to the manufacture stage, people are ramping up. How are we going to make sure that we use all that capacity? Jean, you talked about unprecedented collaboration. Yeah. How do we make sure we use all of it?
Yeah, the number one, one of the specificity of the vaccine manufacturer, it is extremely complex. It requires very labor-intensive and expertise and know-how and quality processes, because beyond the quality, we need also to guarantee the compliancy, the vaccine being compliant, so that the regulators know that all the security, and because again, we give the vaccine to healthy people, we have very stringent requirements. Number two, these type of plants are customized to the technology. So we are familiar, for example, in Sanofi Pasteur, taking my own example, we have the baculovirus expression vector system, and we have an expert centers in US right now. And we need to consider whether we do some enabling center of excellence there. So having manufacturing from what we call the drug substance regarding the bulk product, we'll need to guarantee the quality, the consistency, and the compliancy of his bulk. And then we need to think about also on fill and packaging and formulation, which require also some specific skill on the bottleneck. So I don't think there is extra idle capacity right now in the world. So we need to proactively, that's exactly the dialogue we are in, all of us in industry, with the regulators, with the public health, Ministry of Health, whether there are procurement mechanisms, so we get an idea of the size or the scale up and ramping up our capacity. And then, of course, we have in Europe, we have a large manufacturing footprint in terms of vaccines. So we can certainly leverage that. But keep in mind, there is no extra available capacity, and we need to build proactively, and that we need to take the decision now in terms of investment if we want to have a vaccine by 18 months or 12 months from now. And that's a challenge we are currently facing and discussing, of course, with our partner.
Martin, did you want to come in there?
Yes, and if I could add, it's also important to do all this without disrupting the production of other essential vaccines.
Absolutely.
This is particularly important globally, because we have we don't just have one killer disease to deal with, we have multiple ones. And therefore we have to make sure that as much as possible, we avoid disrupting the production of other critical vaccines that are needed every day and which will still be needed. So it is a big challenge. And obviously, we will also be trying to see how we can use the instruments, the financial instruments we have, to help support increasing the capacity to produce vaccines. So not just using to the full, of course, the existing capacity, but possibly also, and this might be also a kind of also medium to longer term investment we could think of, to also increase, certainly in Europe, the capacity to produce vaccines. And there are many stages of the manufacturing process where we could also support an expansion of that capacity.
Thank you very much. Could you also say 2 words about procurement? What is the EU doing to coordinate procurement and deployment in the EU?
So I think it's clear that, you know, for a challenge of this scale, the procurement in Europe will have to be done as jointly as possible. I mean, I think it would be an illusion to think that individual member states could do it better and faster on their own. It's not going to happen like that because Europe is what it is. We are a number of mostly small, medium-sized countries, and on a global scale, none of the countries are that large. So we have a much better chance of being a strong global player if we pull together. And this also helps industry in its planning, because obviously having to deal with 27 plus jurisdictions is obviously potentially very confusing. Not to mention, of course, you could end up with conflicting decisions if there isn't the coordination. And we want to avoid that we end up with our member states competing with each other for the limited resources that might be available. Yeah. I think the best way to actually help everyone is to work together. This is indeed what we're already working on. We have already some very positive experience with procuring jointly. This is, I think, definitely also in the public interest, because it ensures that all our member states, large or small, no matter the resources they have available, can get access to the vaccine at the same time.
Yeah.
And thus we can avoid the creation of inequalities or some member states being just left out of the picture, having to wait longer for the vaccine.
We are almost out of time. I've taken as many of the questions. We had so many coming in, lots of comments about who should get priority, different questions about that issue, but maybe we can come back to them and look at them afterwards if we keep a record of those question and answers, and you can come back. But I did want to end just by asking each of you briefly, and I'll start with you, Pierre, then I'll go to Martin, and I'll give Jean the last word. If you had to identify one key lesson from the work that has been done so far, the remarkable work being done to develop a vaccine, and one key priority now of all the issues we've raised to make sure we get there, we have something that works, that is safe, that the public has confidence in as fast as possible, what would it be? So a key lesson and a key priority in 1 minute each. I know, it's impossible.
Key lesson, key priority, I think, most of us refer to that as the more transparent way to exchange data, whether it is on the epidemiology of the disease, on what we know about the virus, and also already exchange on what is known about vaccine development, and that happened to occur already now. And I think that's rather unique in the story of development of COVID-19. So really kind of open innovation of all that data.
And is that's your key lesson too, that we haven't got it and we need it?
Well, that's what we learn, and I think we move forward in the right way by doing so.
Thank you very much. Martin, your key lesson learned and your key priority.
I think we have to continue to maintain the emphasis on coordination and cooperation. I mean, this is an unprecedented global challenge. We can only come out of it quickly, or as quickly as possible, if we work together and continue to do so. This is not a time for competition, it's a time for collaboration. And when I say collaboration between governments across the world, with industry, with other actors, with the public, with the professionals, the better we do this, the sooner this will be behind us. And that's, I think, the key message. And we have lots of instruments that we can use at various levels. And therefore, to use those instruments properly, we need a strong coordination. Yeah. And I say this particularly because we'll now be entering a very delicate phase where the disease at the moment might be less in an acute phase than it was some weeks ago. It does not mean that the disease is gone. The disease is still there. It's still circulating globally. It's just the result of our behavior that we have managed to win some time. But it's still out there, and we need to make sure that we have the solution as soon as practically possible.
Thank you very much. And Jean, you started with partnership and collaboration. You underlined it is happening, it is vital. Your key lesson and your key priority.
Yeah, I think all of us can be very proud to be part of the European ecosystem, because we have shown that both from the private sector and public sector can jointly group our forces, our strengths, and to have this unprecedented level of partnerships and commitments, because we are all affected in our lives. We are speaking for homes, for example, because it's another concrete example of that this affects our social lives in Europe. And I think that's the silver lining of this crisis. In terms of messages for the future, maybe we should not forget that momentum we created together, public and private sector partner, unprecedented dialogue, global regulation, harmonization in terms of regulatory, in terms of access, in terms of target product profile, target value profile, etc. And we have a responsibility, I think, for the world and for the next generations to make that example maybe even improve. For example, we know that in US there is one unique emerging infectious disease structure called the BARDA. We don't have such structure in Europe. Maybe for the future, that's a reflection. It takes time. We won't be ready for that. But you know, the problem with virus, they will come again, and we don't know what the next pandemic will be. Zoonosis. There will be some pandemics, and all together, I hope that we can translate together these collective efforts into a fruitful partnership and ultimately foster a constructive dialogue together.
And on that upbeat and uplifting note, the audience can't thank you, so I'm going to give you a round of applause, just me. Thank you so much to all three of you. We could have spent another 2 hours discussing it. Still lots of questions coming in. Apologies to those I didn't get to.
And thank you to you, Jackie, and for Martin and Pierre to have fruitful dialogue.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. I know you're all incredibly busy working on this vital issue. We really do appreciate it. Thank you to all of you who tuned in for this discussion. Thank you for your questions and your comments. And may I wish you a pleasant afternoon. Stay safe. Take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and stay safe too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.